I'd like to invite Dr. Brett Ingram up to talk about some work that's been done on looking at the feasibility of stocking Dusky Flathead. So, Brett, it's all yours.
Thank you. Second load, is it? There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fish stocking, particularly around Dusky Flathead. So stock enhancement in Victoria, it's a fairly important tool that we use for fisheries management. We use it for improving recreational fishing opportunities, so for example salmonids and some of our natives. But we're also using it for conservation purposes to recover some of our threatened species. So again, some of our freshwater native species. So in Victoria, we're stocking about 15 species, and that's all of them there. You'll probably recognise some of these as being estuarine species, so estuary perch, black bream, mulloway and eastern king prawns. And these species have been stocked into waters in the Gippsland area in the past by fisheries. So where we're at the moment, as part of the Target 1 million, we have an initiative there around stocking 5 million fish a year. We're on track to meet that. But if we look in just the Gippsland area, these are the sites that we've been stocking, and you can just see over the last 4 years that sort of increased from a bit under 200,000 a year. We're now up in excess of 500,000 a year just for the Gippsland area. So the feasibility study that we're looking at here is we're looking at determining whether or not it's feasible to establish a breeding program for Dusky Flathead as one species, to re-establish them in some of our estuaries and to enhance the recreational fisheries. So as much as this is about Dusky Flathead, this particular study is also looking at sand flathead and also rock flathead, so a number of different species. So if we go back to Dusky Flathead, why would we consider stocking them? Well, we certainly know that they're a very popular angling species. There might be some stocks that require supplementation to recover them or enhance them, particularly where there might be some issues around recruitment failure or limitations. What Paul indicated, they're relatively sedentary, so that means that if we're going to stock them into the environment, maybe they're not going to go too far away from where we stock them. And of course, we can breed them in captivity, which is really important aspect of being able to do this. But really there's only been one study or pilot study around stocking flathead in Australia, and that was done in southern Queensland into the Maroochy River system by the Queensland Fisheries. And over a couple of years they stocked 2 species, Dusky Flathead and also sand whiting, but they did 2 stocking events with Duskies over the 2 seasons, so in December 1996 and again in December 97. So all up about 100,000 fingerlings, which were produced at a hatchery at Bribie Island. So apart from, so in terms of just assessing the stocking, before they went out and stocked, they did some pre-stocking surveys to understand the population structure before they started, and they also marked fish before they released them. So the results that they were seeing, in the days after release, they got quite highly variable survival rates, so in the first few days, and that variability was related to the size of the fish they were stocking. So smaller fish, not so many surviving, larger fish, better survival. They detected a bin in fisheries surveys about 5 months after release, and in the surveys subsequent to that, the fish that were caught were the stock fish were about 14% on average of the take. They also detected them in the recreational creel and also in the commercial fishery. But as I mentioned, they did surveys before stocking, and they looked at comparing that with the surveys they did after stocking. And one of the fundamental problems they had with this was they failed to detect any significant change in the size of the population as a result of stocking. And they put this down to a number of things. One was that there's just so much variation and variability in populations of flathead, and we've seen that in our Victorian stocks. In the middle of the program, there was a fish kill in Maroochy River, which impacted on the study, and the program was terminated prematurely, so they weren't able to actually continue monitoring to see whether or not they picked up fish from the second stocking. So, as I mentioned, it was stopped prematurely, and the reason for this was that they were failing to detect any evidence that the stocking was having an impact. They did some economic analysis, and it really looked like it wasn't that economically feasible in terms of the cost of stocking compared to the returns to the anglers. And of course, the government decided that marine stocking wasn't part of policy. So we ended before they can really truly assess it. So some of the take-home lessons from this one stocking program, they think that perhaps stock enhancement for flathead is feasible, and particularly where there's signs of recruitment failure, perhaps what we're seeing in some of our estuaries. It's an expensive exercise and difficult, say, compared to our experiences with freshwater fish in particular. It's certainly important to have a monitoring program to estimate and demonstrate the success of stocking. But of course, one of the other things out of this was actually being able to learn how to breed these things in captivity. So as I mentioned, this was done at Bribie Island, a government hatchery in southern Queensland. They used wild-caught broodstock, which were caught locally. The broodstock in the spawning season, in spring, they were injected with a hormone, and these hormones are not too dissimilar to what used in IV programs for mammals. Single injection, once the fish ovulates, the eggs and sperm are stripped from the fish and they're mixed together artificially, and then they're incubated in a tank. And it takes about just under 30 hours for the eggs to hatch. So there's a little photograph on the bottom there that the eggs. So we're talking eggs that are under a millimetre, about 0.5 millimetre in size, so fairly small. So the larvae, once they hatch, they're reared in tanks for up to about 20 days. They're fed on rotifers, so small, aquatic plankton that they also have to culture, and they also feed them on newly hatched brine shrimp. So they're held in the tanks for up to about 3 weeks, and during this time they go through their growing period and they get to about a metamorphosis size, a bit after 10 millimetres. And then from there, they're stocked into a nursery pond. This particular stage is trying to mimic what's happening in the environment where they're going into. So they actually add fertilisers. So they're trying to encourage the growth of plankton on which the fish are going to feed on. So these small microscopic crustaceans that live in the water column. So ponds are fertilised, the fish are stocked in there, and after about 6 weeks, they come out at around about 50 millimetres in size. So you can see on the hand there. And that whole production cycle through this period, they're seeing in an order of anywhere from less than 12% or thereabouts survival through to in excess of 100 or up to 100% recovery. So it's quite variable, but what this demonstrates is that it can be done. So where to from here? We certainly need to consider whether we need to stock Dusky Flathead, the cost associated with that, the demand, and what we expect the returns are from the stocking program. We need to identify the estuaries that might require stocking to recover stocks or enhance stocks, and they might be estuaries that are showing signs of recruitment failure or limitation. We need to estimate the carrying capacity of those estuaries to work out actually how many fingerlings do we need to stock into these waters. We don't know a lot about the genetic structure of flathead right across the coast of eastern Australia. So we need to understand that structure to ensure what we're stocking in is not going to impact on the structure of the populations that are already there. At the moment, there's no hatcheries in Australia producing flathead fingerlings for stocking. So we need to support the establishment of a hatchery to produce flathead for stocking. And of course, lastly, we need to design a program not just around producing fish and stocking fish, but also the back end of it, monitoring that stocking and evaluate the success or failure of that stocking program. And that's me, and that's your flathead, is it, Travis?
You shouldn't encourage him. You shouldn't encourage him.